Good afternoon and welcome. My name is Brandon Minnow. I'm the Senior Director of Experiential Marketing here at Cedar. I want to thank you for joining us for today's Cedar Talk featuring Joe Jimenez. As background, if you're joining us here for the first time, Cedar Talks is our thought leadership series focused on highlighting experienced entrepreneurs, tech innovators, and healthcare leaders who are solving important problems by challenging the status quo. Today's virtual event will conclude in about an hour. Our speakers can't see or hear the audience, but please feel free to use the chat function to add any questions or comments that you may have. And we'll plan to hold a few minutes at the end of the session for audience questions. So before we get started, a couple of quick plugs. First, if you like today's Cedar Talk and want more, you can sign up for our mailing list on the events page at the Cedar website. Our next Cedar Talk is coming up on August 12th with Christina Stembel, the founder and CEO of Farm Girl Flowers. We have a few other really exciting talks coming up this fall, and I promise you will not want to miss those. Secondly, for those of you looking for a new opportunity in a mission-driven organization, well, Cedar is hiring. So today we have a member of our recruiting team available to answer any questions that you may have on careers at Cedar. So to get in touch, hop on over to the Expo tab and feel free to start a chat with our recruiter there. Now I'd like to go ahead and introduce this afternoon's participants. Leading the interview will be Cedar's co-founder and CEO, Florian Otto. And we're excited to hear from Joe Jimenez, the co-founder and managing director at Aditum Bio, a biotech venture firm. From 2010 until 2018, Mr. Jimenez held the position of Chief Executive Officer at Novartis, one of the world's leading pharmaceutical companies. And under his leadership, Novartis developed one of the largest pipelines of self-originated drugs in the industry, really driven by strong commitment to R&D. So welcome. Thank you both for joining us today and sharing your experience. And take it away, Florian.
Thank you very much, Brandon, and thank you, Joe, for joining us. I'm personally extremely excited for our conversation, and there's so much we can learn from you, and we're very excited to hearing more. So let's maybe get started to talk a bit about your career path and how you got into this leadership position. Most people on this talk here are probably most familiar with you from the stints at Heinz, or then, of course, Novartis. Could you talk a little bit about your formative years at Stanford and your leadership positions at Conagra and Clorox, and then the lead up to, of course, those most well-known C-suite roles?
Sure. Thanks, Florian. It's great to be here. You know, if you look at my background, it's a very non-traditional path. I started in consumer packaged goods, and it even goes back to Stanford. I was a competitive swimmer at Stanford, and swimming is a very individual sport. You're spending thousands of hours in the pool, but at the college level, it's also a team sport. So I was able to really learn the value of a team and how together a group of individuals can deliver more than any one individual could have by themselves. And I think that's something that I learned at Stanford that I carried with me throughout my different career path. And, you know, I started at Clorox as a marketing person, and it's really interesting because I end up running one of the biggest pharmaceutical companies in the world. And one of the things that I tell young people that I meet all over the world is, don't take a linear career path. Try to get as many broad experiences as you can get and experience different industries, experience different types of people in terms of the way that they approach problems. And that diversity of experience is something that really helped me kind of every step of the way.
I think it's totally fascinating, and I can, of course, from my background as well, I've moved around the world in very different jobs or positions, which make it probably very tough for me to really get a job at a real company, and why I need to start one. But I would love to hear a bit more about this adjustment, Joe, from really being deep in the consumer brand space, where you were before there at several companies, and then going into the pharma what was let's say, the main big difference where you really needed to learn a lot? You say, okay, I had no idea that this is basically on how pharma works, and you needed to learn and adjust.
I was running a large division of a consumer packaged goods company when I was in London, and AstraZeneca asked me to sit on their board of directors, and that's really how I got my first exposure to the pharmaceutical industry, and I fell in love with it. These people were developing disease-modifying therapies, and I said, I really want to be a part of this. So I tried to figure out how to get into the pharmaceutical industry. And I entered Novartis actually through their over-the-counter drug business. So it was a way for me to leverage what I knew about consumer packaged goods, but also get into a large pharmaceutical company, one that was focused on healthcare. And about 6 months after I got there running this OTC business, the board asked me to run the pharmaceutical division. And I about fell out of my chair, and I said, look, I'm not a physician and I'm not a scientist. And the board said, well, we have a lot of physicians and a lot of scientists. What we don't have is somebody who can look at the way that the world is changing and position the division to win in that new world. And somebody with a consumer background or a marketing background is exactly what the division needs. So as I went into the division, I was very nervous about how different it would be. And because B2C versus B2B, at Novartis, many of our customers, our biggest customers, are governments around the world as opposed to consumers. And so it was very interesting, though, to see the similarities. I would say 60, even 70% of running that pharmaceutical division was very similar to running a consumer packaged goods company. You have procurement, you have a lot of indirect spend, a lot of direct spend. You've got human resources and people managing careers. You have a board that you're managing. You have many similar things. Obviously, the science and the medicine and the products are very different. But there were a lot of similarities that actually allowed me to bring what I learned from a very different and lower margin business into a pharmaceutical business where they hadn't had some of the issues that the consumer packaged goods business had. So I was able to apply my learning. One example is just in procurement, right? The pharma division at Novartis had $10 billion of indirect spend every year. And when I got into that business, I asked around to my people, how are contracts set and how are prices set? And the answer back was similar to the way that people negotiated 20 years ago, sitting across the desk. They had never done any kind of reverse auctioning. And as you know, in consumer packaged goods, the margins are lower. And so you're scraping through every penny that you can find. So I brought in actually one of my heads of procurement from the consumer business and brought them into the pharma division. And we were able to take about $2 billion of cost out in a very short period of time. So I think there are, any business that you're working on, there are very specific things unique to that business, but there's a lot about just running a business that is quite similar.
I think it's fascinating. That's, of course, back to the point where you also said one of the most valuable lessons is literally to apply something that you learned in one part of the economy or one part of businesses to another one. And that's, of course, I think a very fascinating story. Would love to talk right now a bit about leadership. And you are very, very passionate also about company culture. And I heard you say that the most important leadership lesson you learned could be distilled into behavior as a function of consequence, ensuring that people felt safe bringing up bad news. So the question, I totally agree with that. And I think it makes total sense to really, to bring up the bad news and to really try to solve this problem. How would you recommend leaders right now instill this aspect of culture into their companies and teams?
Well, this behavior as a function of consequence was a huge lesson for me. I had I had some success in the US and was given a turnaround situation to go to Europe to run a division that was underperforming. And so I went in there charged up, right? I was going to turn the division around. And in my first month, we missed our sales forecast by about 10%. And so I said, okay, bad luck. We'll double down and we'll do better the next month. We missed that forecast by 15%. And then the end of the quarter came and we missed that by 20%. And so I stepped back and I said, look, what is wrong here? We don't know how to forecast our business, so we don't really know where we are, and we can't invest if you don't know where you are. So I brought in McKinsey to help us build a great forecasting process for the division. And they had a binder that was this thick, and we trained everybody, still missed. So there was something fundamentally wrong in the company. So I brought in a behavioral psychologist and I said, go deep into the company and come back and tell me what you think is wrong here. And she spent a number of weeks, but came back to me and said, Joe, you don't have a forecasting issue. You have a behavioral issue in this company. At every level of the organization, people are afraid to bring bad news. So, when you miss your sales forecast in a month, everybody knows you're going to miss it, but nobody wants to tell you. And they don't want to tell their boss because the consequence of telling your boss that you were going to miss a forecast was so painful and punished that people stopped doing it. And so before the division could turn around, we had to change the behavior in the company. And I had to change my behavior too. Because I saw myself as part of the problem, right? Somebody comes up and says, we're not going to make our forecast. You say, go make your forecast, go deliver the sales. I had to actually thank people for bringing me bad news. So I remember it well. Somebody came into my office and said, we're halfway through the year. We're not going to make our forecast for the year. We're off. And I said, thank you for bringing me this news. Now you're not off the hook. Together, we're going to build a plan. We've got 6 months left before the end of the year. Let's build a marketing plan or an overall business plan that will help us get as close to that number as we could get. And that was kind of the beginning of the revelation that before you can change behavior in an organization, you have to really understand the consequence that you personally are delivering for certain types of behavior. So to directly answer your question, my advice to anyone that's moving up in an organization or leading an organization is to really understand the consequences in your organization for certain types of behavior. For example, if somebody takes a risk and that risk doesn't play out and they're punished for that, how many people are going to take risks? They're not, because the consequence of taking that risk was punishing. But if you can celebrate the fact that they took a risk, you don't necessarily, I'm not a big believer in celebrating failure, but I am a big believer in celebrating taking calculated risks that sometimes end in success, sometimes they end in failure. But the outcome is not as important as the fact that they took a calculated risk. If you reward that behavior, you can change organizations, you can change the culture of an organization. But if you don't pay big attention to the incentives and the consequences of certain types of behavior, you're never going to change the culture of your company.
Yeah, I totally love this, because that's the only way how you can really just move forward as an organization is, of course, by literally taking some risks, sometimes failing. You hope you win a little bit more often, and knowing where you can do it and where you cannot do it. And I'm 100% sure that that you were not excited about too much risk taking when it comes to the composition of drugs, also because it's too regulated. And it's the same at Cedar. We are not really jeopardizing anything on the privacy of the patient side and on the patient data. But on most of the other things, where you basically say a calculated risk, which is not jeopardizing the company, very often it's better to make a decision. Very often you can correct this as well. If it's a wrong decision, it's way better than not taking any decision. And I think this concept of encouraging risk taking and not blaming if somebody brings bad news is absolutely fundamental for this, and really appreciate you showing us on how you instilled that.
Sure. No, Florian, I think, culture is nothing but a set of behaviors that an organization accepts. And so you have the ability to shape that culture by ensuring that the consequences of behavior, both positive and negative, are taking your company in the direction that you want to take it from a culture standpoint.
Yeah, and also sharing failure yourself. So I always try to do that within the company to show, okay, I missed something here, I failed here. Because if I, as a CEO, do this, then it gives permission to the entire team to do this as well. So would love right now to talk a bit about also another cultural trait that you're very passionate about, this, which is more on the focus side. As a swim captain, you mentioned that at Stanford, and then afterwards as a CEO of Novartis, you said that you learned the importance of aligning everyone around a crystal clear common goal so that everybody can internalize and act on it. Do you have any advice around that concretely on how to instill that in the cultures of the companies?
Yeah, as I've moved through my career, it's very clear that when you build a strategy for a company, it's very important that you distill that strategy down to the level that everyone in the company can understand it, whether you work in the mailroom or whether you work in the research lab. And so it's number one, coming up with the vision that you want to create for your company, the strategy, like the 3 or 4 things that you have to do to deliver on that vision, and then giving people, everyone in the organization, line of sight as to the role that they're going to play in delivering on that strategy. So I spent a lot of time at Novartis thinking about, when we built the strategy for the company, how do we push this all the way down to every person in the organization so that they understand that they have a role to play in building the company into what we wanted to build it into. So I've seen so many strategies built that kind of sit on the shelves and people don't get rallied behind them because they don't really understand what their role is in helping deliver it. So that to the extent that you can cascade it down and really help everybody understand their role, I think you get super high energy from your entire organization.
Yeah, that's very interesting. And one maybe follow-up question on that, Joe, is kind of one of the business questions that we asked ourselves as well earlier this year, when we were razor sharp focused on one business line, doing literally everything that is on the digital communication between the patient and the healthcare system. And then we basically made the plunge into a new business line with the acquisition of UDA and then the Series D. Of course, there was always, and we knew this, there's a risk of defocusing, of doing too much. I'm extremely happy that we did it, and we were really struggling. Do you have some guidance maybe? Because I'm pretty sure this will happen to us again, this question. I would love to hear on which kind of framework you use there, or any guidance.
Yeah, when I track how Cedar has built its business and the acquisition that now gets you into the insurance business also, it's very interesting because you're growing the company in a way that makes strategic sense, but it might not make as much sense to people deeper in the organization. Even though you don't have a huge organization today, it is very important, I think. My only advice would be to make sure that everybody knows what the end game is, what are we trying to accomplish, and then where do each of these elements fit in? Okay, the Series D allows us to do this. We now have the financial capability and capacity to be able to do this, this, and this. The acquisition of UDA puts us in this new business that is related to ours. But to the extent that you're explaining this so that the rank and file can understand and that they understand their role in delivering on the vision that you and the board has for Cedar, I think you just create huge energy in the organization. And then with each additional step, so if you make another acquisition, it's, okay, how does this fit in to the overall vision that we've kind of laid out for the company?
Yeah, thank you for sharing that. Another topic that is basically maybe just following up on strategic focus is also simplicity, because rather have something simple that everybody understands, you're advocating that and saying that if you can't hold something in your head, then you're not going to be able to internalize it and act on it. So, which is basically pointing out that if you have to distill the strategy down to the essence to win. What does that mean for you in the new biopharma VC role?
Well, it's interesting. We all like to hire really, really smart people. The problem with really smart people sometimes is that they overcomplicate solutions to problems. And so one of the things that I brought to Novartis when I first went there and met these brilliant scientists, physician scientists, and brilliant business people was, don't give me a 50-page PowerPoint deck that tells me what you're going to do and why you're going to do it. Try to distill what you want to do into a recommendation, 3 reasons why it makes sense, and what your next steps are. You can usually fit it on a page. And if you can articulate that and you can hold that in your head, then the clarity with which you act is much, much better than if you've got a much more elaborate and complicated solution to a particular problem, where you kind of have to go back to the formula every time you're throwing a curveball. But if you've got it in your head and you know exactly what you're trying to do, you can communicate it to people, it's your compass. And so your question about how we relate that to the biotech business that we're in right now, we're in the business of investing in therapies that we can bring to patients. We operate in the translational phase of medicine, phase 1 and phase 2. And we just ask 3 simple questions about every therapy that we see. Number 1 is there a high level of unmet medical need here? The second is, will the mechanism of this particular molecule that we are studying about in licensing or investing in, will that interrupt the disease in a way that is meaningful? So we'll have a clear point of difference and impact the disease. And then the third thing that we ask is there a homogeneous patient population that will give us a clear and definitive answer as to whether this drug will really work, so that we're not throwing good money after bad and continuing to invest. If we get the answers to those 3 questions and they're yes, then we move into our full-blown due diligence, where we do financial and legal due diligence. But I'll tell you, answering those first 3 questions has knocked out so many potential acquisitions that we could have made, that we just say, we're not going near it. We're not going to invest the money in the due diligence because we don't have an affirmative answer to one of those 3 questions. I think that simplicity has led to an efficiency at Aditum Bio that's going to pay off in the long term.
Yeah, and I think it's also sometimes important just to accept that probably some companies that are amazing fall through your roster. And in that case, you just need to accept that. And that's probably happening. And then again,
that's exactly right.
So a lot, Joe, that you are applying right now, especially in the drug discovery, is of course also on what you learned during your time at Novartis. And you were overseeing many also on these firm-wide changes, including a shift to regenerative medicine, digital transformation, and an emphasis on an outcome-based approach for patient treatments to address these needs for growing and aging population. But that also meant that you had to shift the focus from the short-term earnings targets to research and development spending by prioritizing recruiting the best physicians and best scientists. Can you maybe talk to us about that period and how you navigated this transition, and maybe also what you think of as your greatest success as part of this strategic pivot?
Sure. So when I took over Novartis as chief executive, I was facing a situation where in 2 years, we were going to lose patent protection of our 2 largest drugs. Those 2 largest drugs represented 25% of total Novartis sales. So you can imagine we had a lot of people in the company that wanted to retire right before that period. And I had to step back and say, how are we going to get through that period with growth? Not even taking a 25% sales reduction, but how do we grow? And we did a couple of things. The first is exactly what you said, which was we doubled down on research and development. I took my R&D spending from what was around $6 to $7 billion up to $9 billion a year for that period, so that we could jumpstart programs and we could build the pipeline into what is a best-in-class pipeline. But that also was going to take time. So the second thing that we did is we acquired and we in-licensed drugs from biotech companies that could help us in the short term. Because again, these drugs were going off patent in a very short number of years. And we were able to bring them in, and they were meaningfully contributing to the top line and the bottom line in the short term. And then the third thing that we did is we doubled down on China. I had a very good business in China, but it was being managed more for profit than for top line sales growth. And because of the economy in China and what the long term could mean, we started investing very heavily in building larger field forces and investing in medical and development organizations in China. And that led to also an exponential growth rate in China. So and I had to go to the street and say that I was doing this, right? So nobody likes surprises. So I had to explain that all the analysts on Wall Street saw that Novartis was going to lose 25% of its sales due to the patent expiration of Diovan, which was an antihypertensive, and Gleevec, which was a drug for chronic myeloid leukemia. And this was the plan that was going to get us through that period with growth. We actually got through that period without any sales dip, believe it or not. And I think one of the things that I'm most proud of, to the final part of your question, was the portfolio transformation, right? Part of this whole plan was to refocus the company on what we did the best, and that was pharmaceutical research, development, and commercialization. And so on one day in 2015, I announced a 3-way swap of big chunks of our portfolio with GSK and with Eli Lilly. And we were able to do a very, very complicated set of transactions as 3 companies coming together and trading parts of our portfolio that made sense. For example, I had a vaccines business that was subscale, and it was never going to have the kind of scale that GSK's vaccine business had. So I gave them our vaccines business in return for GSK's oncology business. They were subscale in oncology. We were bigger in oncology, and we could click that acquisition right into our oncology group and generate tremendous growth. So I think that portfolio transformation is kind of the end point of that strategic phase of the company's life, is really what I'm most proud of.
Yeah, it must be very difficult for a pharma leader to literally always reinvent the company, because by default after 20 years the company is worth 0 and you always need to build up the new company every single year in order to keep the pipeline up. I think it's absolutely fascinating business, and I admire really, Joe, and would love to just dive a little bit deeper into what we touched already in the beginning, that you applied standard business metrics into pharma cash flow, purchasing, competitive bidding. You talked a little bit about that. And then so brought this consumer goods experience into Novartis. And that, of course, had a lot of impact. First of all, yes, you probably saved a few $1 billion. You mentioned $2 billion. That's a lot of money. But besides that, that probably had also some other impacts, like reducing complexity in some parts, which is even, I think, probably a hidden benefit on that. I can also imagine that on the other side, that caused some problems within the organization, because changing is not nice. And pharma is a high margin business. So by default, you probably accumulate some fat in the business. Can you just talk a bit more about how did the organization, how did the street react to that? What were the benefits? What were the downsides of doing this?
Yes. Well, one of the things, aside from that procurement story that I told you earlier, one of the things that I did not understand when I went into pharma was the concept of mirrored field forces. Now, in our US business, I know this sounds funny to anybody who's not in pharma, but we had 7 different sales forces that sold the same drug, Diovan, which was a $5 billion antihypertensive. And the thing that was craziest about this is that the sales forces didn't talk to each other, but they would literally go into the physician's office at different times of the day. And as this was being described to me, a light went off, and I said, so these people, these sales reps, are gross rating points. They're actually just 30-second advertisements for the physician to hear about Diovan. And it's nuts, right? If you think about it, 7 sales forces. It's an incredibly inefficient way to go to market, but it always seemed to pay out when they would add more and more, and they got to these ridiculous numbers. It wasn't just Novartis, it was everybody in the industry with these mirrored sales forces. So we changed all of that. We said, we're not going to do that. We're going to have 2 field forces, and you know what? They're going to talk to each other. And the physicians don't want to see 7 different sales reps from Novartis. They want to see 1 or maybe 2. And so we totally changed the model in the US over this period of about 2 to 3 years. And we took hundreds of millions of dollars out of the cost structure of that business. And people resisted, right? They said, if you do this, you know, the bottom's going to fall out, because we know that this is having an effect on sales, because we're communicating with the physician and we're staying top of mind, and that physician, you know, understands the benefit of this drug. But it was such overkill that when we got rid of it, nothing bad happened. The business actually grew, because with its simplicity and with a coordinated effort around communicating the benefit of the drug, it was actually better for everyone. And you know, the resistance that I had, I still come back to behavior as a function of consequence, right? I had to show people what was going to happen to our company if we didn't radically change the cost structure, because we were going to lose 2 of our most profitable drugs because to patent loss. The patents were expiring, and that the consequence of not doing anything was going to mean bad things for everybody that was associated with the company. So they had to see that what we were doing was in the best interest of the patients that need our drugs, the research and development organization that needed the dollars to be able to discover and develop those drugs. And it's just a very interesting case study in how to change the mentality of a group that at first thinks this is going to be not a smart thing to do, but then they see the actual results and they think, okay, maybe I can think differently. Some people didn't make the cut. They couldn't make the change. They resisted too much, and they wanted to go to a more traditional pharma company. So they left us and they went over to another company, which is fine. I think you're not going to be able to change everybody's view and everybody's opinion, but you change the majority and you win the hearts and minds of the majority, and then you can do amazing things.
I think that's fascinating, and when you're very clear also on what are your expectations, then the right people will always stay with you, and the people that leave, it's probably for the better for both parties. Let's maybe go to one of the questions before we go into Aditum Bio from the audience, because it's very related to this topic. It's a question from Jared. What were the key differences in gap closing actions regarding the forecast between CPG and Novartis?
Yeah, that's a very good question. In CPG, it's a much faster moving business, so you can launch new products in a period of months as opposed to 5 years, 6 years that it takes to even just do the research phase of a drug. So gap closing in pharma is much more around tactical things that you can do with either reducing costs or acquiring new drugs that can come in and immediately contribute to a gap that you see in your growth trajectory over the next few years. So a lot of it is inorganic in terms of growth, but organic in terms of cost reduction. And that's quite different than in CPG, where you can, in very short order, close a gap by doubling down on research and development and launching a number of products that can come out in basically a period of months. It's a good question, though.
Yeah, and it of course also shows on how you need to communicate properly to the street, and you need to see whether they are specialized analysts or just general analysts, and then communicating it in different ways.
Yes.
So let's put your public company hat right now off the table and go to your next venture. So you were 8 years successfully at the helm of Novartis, and then started Aditum Bio. And obviously, as CEO of one of the world pharma companies, is an enviable position also to be in. A lot of glamour and also, of course, a lot of pain. But share with us a bit on what made you do this decision in 2019.
Yes, when I came out of Novartis, I had the opportunity to run 2 different US public companies, and I said no. And I said no because I'd already done that before. When I looked back on my career and thought about what I had not done, is I had never started something from scratch and then built it into something meaningful that could then be passed on to people who helped me build it. And so Dr. Mark Fishman, who was my head of research at Novartis, retired from Novartis before I did. But when I stepped down, we both saw an opportunity based on our experience at Novartis. One of the worst parts of our jobs was to constantly reprioritize the drug development pipeline at the company. And that was because we had a fixed amount of development dollars that had to go up against the most promising programs. And so there was so much coming out of the research group that we had to raise the bar almost every quarter with what we were going to fund in development. And it got to the point where there were many very good and promising drugs that just didn't make the cut in terms of getting resources at the company. And so we shelved them. We either shelved them, sometimes we out-licensed them, but mostly we just didn't act on them, which is really horrible because the patients that needed some of those drugs needed to get them. And the physician scientists that worked on them for 5 years in the discovery labs, were demoralized when that happened. So we went out and we raised a fund, and we called the company Aditum Bio. Aditum is the Latin word for access. And our mission at Aditum is to provide access to medicines that otherwise may not reach patients for whatever reason. And so we're a little bit counter trend. We're staying out of oncology because oncology has more resources than anybody knows what to do with. Everybody wants to be in oncology. We're going into disease areas where there are large patient populations and where there are not there's not a lot of activity by pharma or biotech around bringing these drugs to market. And so it's a mission-driven company. We've had great success. In our first 2 years, we've acquired 6 therapies that are moving into phase 2 clinical trials, and we're having a blast doing it.
That's great to hear, and that you're having a blast and definitely helping also millions of patients potentially in the next decades to come. I think that's always the most motivating piece on the job in healthcare. Would love right now to talk a bit more about your mission and the positioning. And the Aditum Bio mission positions you as an alternative outlet that leverages genetic, genomic, and artificial intelligence to give patients access to medicines. You mentioned that they were not otherwise be developed due to strategic decisions and high expenses during these clinical trials. And can you talk maybe a bit more in detail right now about which candidates or types of discoveries you're currently working on, and some of the biggest opportunities that excite you in this space? And we understand it's not oncology.
Sure. Well, at Aditum Bio, we operate at the translational phase of medicine, which is phase 1, phase 2. So we generally stay out of research, and we generally will stay out of phase 3 as a starting place. We want to be in that place where the first in human data is generated. And that's because partly for my investors, right? That is the place where the least amount of capital generates the greatest value inflection for a particular drug. And so when we were deciding which disease areas to go into, a lot of it was impacted by what happened with COVID-19 and the stay-at-home orders that everyone was going through. We saw opioid use go up. We saw alcohol use go up. We saw depression rates go up. We saw obesity rates go up because people were at home. They were scared. It was not a good situation. So we built our portfolio around some of these big disease areas where pharma doesn't invest a whole lot of money. So for example, one of the drugs that we're developing is a drug for addiction. And we're going to first test this drug in alcohol use disorder, but it also, we believe the mechanism will work in cocaine addiction and potentially opioid addiction. This is a very important area where there's not a lot of investment in pharmaceuticals, and we're going to put that drug into phase 2 testing in 2022. Another drug that we just in-licensed was one for depression. We got this from a Japanese listed pharma company, and there's a sub-patient population within depression where we believe this mechanism is going to be a very important drug. Again, depression rates, if you look at what's happened in the last 12 to 18 months, almost 40% of Americans have said that they had feelings of depression over the last 12 to 18 months. So we think this is another area of big unmet medical need. And then a third area is in obesity. We've in-licensed a drug that actually builds muscle while it reduces weight. And so there's a very specific type of obese patient, an obese patient that has very low muscle mass that may not be able to take some of the appetite suppressant drugs that are out there that work on suppressing appetite. This drug works through a different mechanism that enables that obese patient that doesn't have high muscle mass to still see significant weight loss and not have additional muscle loss that could lead to weakness that is an unintended consequence. So virtually everything that we do at Aditum is focused on larger patient populations. You know, it's a bit counter trend. Everything in pharma is going towards rare diseases, super high price points, gene editing, cell therapy. That all has a very, very important role to play. but the Aditum mission is to go to broader patient populations and see if we can help them with some new therapies that otherwise might not make it to market.
That's fascinating. And then just for the understanding of the audience, Aditum is doing investments in these companies, minority or majority, and then follows on throughout the life cycle, and then potentially sees whether there's a divestiture opportunity and maybe the company is better suited to be part of a larger company?
Yes, for the most part, we are the sole investor in the drugs that we acquire. So what we do is we go to the pharma company and we tell them, we'll give you 10 to 12% of the new co that we set up. Each one of the drugs that we in-license, we set up a separate legal structure because they're owned. The ownership structure is a bit different. We give them ownership, but Aditum basically is the majority owner. And then each of the newcos that are set up have 3 to 4 dedicated individuals. We don't build out big management teams during this translational phase of medicine. We hire a chief medical officer, a project manager, and we have functional experts in regulatory, clinical operations, quality assurance that manage across the newcos. And the key here is to really have a very efficient model during this phase 1, phase 2 period. Then when we get to the end of phase 2, we have all kinds of options. If the data looks good and one of the big pharma companies wants to acquire it, we put it in their hands and they take it through phase 3 and commercialization. If we think that the opportunity is big for us to actually start a real biotech company around it, we will then go raise additional outside money and build a management team around that newco with a CEO, a CFO, and a full staff to bring that drug to phase 3 and to commercialization. So quite a number of options, but in this translational phase of medicine, Aditum is the majority owner.
Thank you for sharing that. You mentioned already a bit on the COVID-19 impact, especially on the R&D. Would love to hear from you a bit more on what do you see as this biggest long-term impact on the pharmaceutical R&D?
You know, I think COVID-19 has done a couple of things. The first is it's improved the reputation of pharmaceutical companies. And this was very important because pharma companies were, down there with tobacco companies. And I think based on the speed with which the vaccine was developed and some of the antivirals were developed, I think, you look at the numbers and the public impression of pharma companies has moved up substantially. And I think that's going to be a long-term effect. But the second and even more important element that this has created is it's created new interest in vaccines and antivirals, right? Vaccines and antivirals were not a huge place of investment for pharma companies. It was all going against oncology and rare diseases. But now the companies have seen that you can help a very large number of patients with vaccines, and you can earn a good return while you're doing it. So for me personally, the fact that antivirals is now getting a new level of energy in terms of investment from the venture community, but also for pharma, is critically important because, this is not the last virus that the world is going to see. And I think the more capability that we build in this infrastructure, particularly here in the US, I think the better off we're all going to be.
Yeah, I think we will see on what's going on there. And I think this criticism on pharma sometimes was based on this just tiny bit better treatment for much more money in order to increase the profits.
Yes.
And people, of course, got tired of that for a reason. And right now with the vaccines was completely the opposite, where literally, let's call it a moderate R&D. Of course, that was literally blitz scaling and very fast. A huge humanitarian impact on the positive side was being made by this delivery. So I think it is also interesting to see on how the pharma companies right now just literally develop this muscle and say, I think we can do these groundbreaking things. We can do them fast, and we can change the world with this.
I hope that's the case.
Yeah, we would be very excited about that. And then I would love to hear a bit more on this variation between being fast and sometimes also being patient. Because right now you're in the very, very early stage of this entire development of the drugs. Can you maybe talk a bit more on what is the balance? How do you keep the team motivated when literally the result is years and years out until you really see the impact? It's very easy when you have a decision, you make something, you are saving millions of lives because you have a great drug. That takes, of course, tens of years and usually more failure than success. How do you keep the team motivated? How can you give maybe some advice also for us on how to really exercise this patience muscle to strike the right balance between agility and bringing a team along this business journey?
Well, when you're working in pharmaceuticals, particularly, you have to have a lot of patience just because the amount of time that it takes to bring to market. But that doesn't mean that you can't motivate the team by breaking down the elements of drug discovery and development into its basic pieces. For example, and then moving fast on each of those individual pieces. For example, we started the first clinical trial, the first phase 2 clinical trial in January for Aditum Bio. And we worked with a company called TrialSpark, which is a tech-enabled contract research organization that's built a tech platform that can execute clinical trials faster and at a lower cost than traditional CROs. And the speed with which the team, both TrialSpark and the Terrace Bio team, which is the new co from Aditum that was executing the trial, that team was able to start up that phase 2 clinical trial and recruit patients faster than I have ever seen, right? In terms of when we got that NDA approved until we were physically in the clinical trial, I'd never seen that before. And rallying the team around speed of executing a clinical trial and recruiting patients into that trial is a way for you to, compartmentalize something that is a very long development cycle, but still get people energized around each piece of the development process.
Thank you for sharing that. And getting the team motivated also, of course, really relies on very good communication. And I've heard you articulating this importance of always connecting with as many people as possible at your companies. And Novartis, of course, was a very different scale than right now at Aditum Bio. But you, for example, I think used a weekly blog to interact literally with the entire company. Have you kept any of those communication channels up and in order to connect with your team right now? And is there any advice you can give to me as the CEO of a fast growth company?
Well, when I was at Novartis, we had over 120,000 employees. So I needed to find a way digitally to communicate with all of them. At Aditum, I don't need to communicate digitally, but I have to be, physically present and being able to do it. Now at Cedar, you're faced with a situation where you're growing very quickly. Your numbers of employees are increasing rapidly because of the strength of the business and because of acquisitions that you're making. And so, my advice to you would be to look for that combination of physical presence and digital presence, given that the importance of communicating the strategy of the company and how we're progressing kind of on a weekly and monthly basis is so critical to keeping that energy up. And so, you're going to see many more challenges than I'm seeing at Aditum in terms of the ability to communicate with a rapidly growing number of employees. So I would just say it's got to be a combination of physical presence, because nothing replaces being there physically, but also supplementing that with a lot of digital communication.
Yeah, and it's definitely a hard work to do good communications, and it gets more important the faster the companies grow, because just the average tenure of every single colleague is much lower than at a more stable company.
Yes.
So maybe my last question, Joe, is more, we talked a bit about strategy, we talked a bit about focus, we talked a lot about the industry. Right now, let's maybe talk about really talent, how to get the right people on the bus, which is, I think, the one of the most important things in every single business. And you have talked about your 3 highest criteria for great talent. It's integrity, technical skill, and then emotional need to deliver results. So really this being action oriented. Would love to hear a bit more for you to maybe elaborate a bit on that. And even more important, I think, is how do you really evaluate that in the interviews?
Right. Well, the first thing around integrity is those people make hundreds of decisions every day that I never see. So the first thing you have to think about is, do they have integrity, and are they going to think about things in a very specific way and do the right thing? And then technical competence obviously is self-explanatory, but the third around emotional need to deliver results. I've hired a lot of people, and the best people that I've hired all had a common trait, and that they physically had an emotional need to deliver results, and that drove them. It drove their energy level. It drove their activity. And so what I found is that, and I've had to hire people over Zoom over the last 18 months because we weren't meeting people, and we've hired a lot of people at Aditum. And so the way that I get at that is just through behavioral interviewing to understand in their past, without asking them directly, do I see evidence of each of those 3 things? The last one's very easy to assess, right? Do they seem like the person who has an emotional need to deliver results? I think you can answer that question pretty easily, even in a Zoom meeting.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it is. It definitely is. I think the skills is always extremely easy. That is not a problem. So competence, that's a very easy thing. I think these behavioral traits, they take a little bit longer to really understand, and sometimes you just spend a bit more time throughout the process with the candidate.
Yes.
Joe, that was extremely insightful. Thank you very much for spending your time here with us. The audience definitely appreciated very much that you shared all of your knowledge and your experiences. And thank you what you're doing for healthcare. The world definitely needs more entrepreneurs like you.
Thanks very much for having me.
Thank you, Joe.